Thank you, Brooks, for inviting me. My name is David Mellor. I'm from the Center for Open Science. We're a nonprofit tech company who has a three-part mission in order to gather evidence, in order to encourage change and increase the rates of reproducibility and transparency in science, create incentives and provide trainings in order to embrace change, and then build technology in order to enable the actions for which we advocate. And so that is realized in our three-part organizational strategy. So our meta-science team conducts replication studies to identify barriers to successfully replication. So reproducibility projects in psychology, ongoing projects in cancer biology and social sciences identifies the barriers to reproducibility. Our community team takes those lessons learned and advocates for trainings and for policies that address the issues that our reproducibility projects identify. And then our infrastructure team builds software solutions and builds infrastructure to enable the actions for which we advocate. So those policy documents I'm going to be talking about start with the top guidelines, the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines. Were created as a result of a meeting back in 2014 from a diverse group of researchers, funders, publishers, and societies in order to promote policies that can make science more open and reproducible. They cover 8 policy statements for increasing the transparency and ultimately reproducibility. Each of the policy statements are agnostic to discipline. They have a very low barrier to entry, and they're modular, so individual societies or journals can adopt individual policies that are appropriate for them. And let me give you an example of what that framework looks like. So the 8 standards are covered here: data citation practices, data materials and code transparency. So should the analytical code, should the digital or physical objects be shared or not? Design transparency gets to reporting guidelines. Study and analysis pre-registration specifies before a study begins whether or not it exists or how the analysis will be conducted. And then replication standards for making that a more acceptable part of the published literature. So each of these standards can be adopted piecemeal by any individual journal or society or publisher that wanted to do so. They can take policies that are appropriate for or where they're ready to go. And you don't have to take all of them. You can take them piecemeal, roughly speaking. The 3 tiers of the top guidelines are disclosure requirements, a requirement to do something, and then a verification or perhaps peer review that the action was taken. And I should say there's 3 there listed. There's actually a 4th one, specifically level 0, we would say, is sort of the status quo. So encouragement or not saying anything at all about a policy. So if you encourage data sharing practices, we've seen in earlier sessions that those statements of encouragement to share data are fairly ineffective. And so that was fairly consciously labeled level 0. And so this is what AAAS is doing with requirements for those particular standards and disclosure or just acknowledgement of replication policies. And they'll be implementing these policies as they see fit. So what I wanted to do now is give examples of all those different standards at all those different levels to demonstrate how each of the different policies can be implemented at a journal, at a society, or at different publishing organizations. So level 1 for the data analytics methods and research materials policies, this is what the Psychonomics Society is moving forward with. These are the disclosure standards for these policies that they've adopted on their website. So the Psychonomics Society is a group of 7 journals in the psychological literature, and they are asking researchers to, as they submit their articles for publication, simply disclose whether or not the data will be available. Now that's a fairly low standard, obviously, but it's a step in the right direction because status quo, again, the vast majority of published literature, the data are not available, and a researcher is not ever being asked whether or not the data will or are being shared openly. So with those disclosure statements, at least once in the research cycle, that issue has to be considered. And so it's a way to start the conversation about what the appropriate way to share or not is. Level 2, the authors must share data And of course, there are exceptions to that mandate. The most frequently provided exception is for ethical considerations. We're not going to share data that's personally identifiable information, rare species, or further examples. PLOS is well known. AGU has a author share or data sharing mandate, again with exceptions permitted. And then level 3 is a real reach goal, and this is this example was given in the morning session, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but the American Journal of Political Science, a couple of other journals are doing this a little bit more recently in partnership with the Odom Institute at University of North Carolina, actually verify that the data and the analysis scripts that are reported in the publication can be used to reproduce the findings. So what they do is the authors submit the code and the data along with the rest of the manuscript, and it won't be accepted for publication until that data set and that analysis code can be used to reproduce the figures and the findings reported in the manuscript. And that, depending on where you what your expectations are, that can seem like a really low barrier, very obvious thing that you should be able to do. Or if you have another perspective, that can seem like a huge barrier. And it does, in fact, take months to do. When they first started this out, about roughly 2 years ago, I think they're a quarterly journal, and every article submitted failed that basic test on the initial go around. They've been doing it for 2 years now. Both authors and handling editors and the folks at the Odom Institute are continually improving guidelines and best practices. Authors are getting more used to what these expectations are, and now many more of the authors get through with just one submission or maybe just one resubmission of that analysis script and the data provided. So it's possible. The standards on design analysis transparency really get to the meat of reporting guidelines. So what actually happened and what are you reporting on? And again, that seems like a fairly basic, straightforward requirement. Say everything you did. But in the era of ever-shrinking method sections, it's actually very difficult, and we've learned this through both the reproducibility projects in psychology and cancer biology. It's quite difficult to figure out exactly what the original manuscript, what the original study did. It's not always in the manuscript, but there are a growing example of reporting guidelines. The Equator Network is the best, largest resource for reporting guidelines. It's very heavily focused in the clinical sciences, but there are examples across many disciplines now. Cell Press has been working on their standardized, transparent, accessible reporting guidelines. And so that's basically putting another layer behind the article with a fairly robust checklist of items that need to be reported. Nature Research has a comprehensive reporting checklist, as is Biomed Central and many others. Preregistration is something that is relevant to all inferential work, all hypothesis testing research, but it's not a standard outside of the clinical sciences. What preregistration of studies does is simply specifies in a registry that the work is going to be completed. So it helps to address the file drawer problem, where we don't know exactly how much work is conducted that later gets published. Preregistration of the analysis plan addresses other issues. It clarifies the distinction between confirmatory work and the more exploratory research. Exploratory research is digging through a data set, looking for something that's unexpected, results in new knowledge, and you've got a testable hypothesis once you've dug through that data set to look for it. With that testable hypothesis, you then need to put that to another round of testing with new data that you can't have collected before, and that really puts that hypothesis to a very rigorous test, and the results of that are held to the highest standard of rigor. And the issues that we see addressing from the reproducibility projects is that when you present exploratory research as confirmatory, it really increases the likelihood of publishability, but it really comes at the expense of credibility. So you basically invalidate the test statistics when you unintentionally conflate the two. And preregistration creates a timestamp of your analysis plan before you start looking at the data to make that distinction clear. And then finally, replications. Replications are boring. Nobody wants to look at replications because they're boring. Somebody's already done it, you think. But it really is the gold standard of scientific evidence. In the charter, or the the logo of the Royal Society is, take nobody's word for it. You have to see, you have to be able to do it yourself in order to, for it to be not just hearsay. So replication is, a direct replication is the way to create that gold standard of evidence and scientific credibility. So with both of these standards together, pre-registration replication, level 1 is simply disclose whether or not the work was pre-registered, and then to encourage replication studies. And again, the Psychonomic Society is taking a level 1 approach of what those, of those two standards. Was this hypothesis testing work pre-registered? And they will consider replication studies. Level 2 of these standards is what we call sort of a results-blind peer review process. So there's a strong bias against null results. Null results, again, boring. Nobody wants to see null results. Everyone wants to see what actually cures cancer. We don't care about what doesn't cure cancer. But those null results are extremely valuable, and frankly, they're more likely to be correct for a variety of reasons. So removing some of the bias against null results is really difficult to do, because once you see the null results, you're biased against the methodology that produced them. You question the competence of the researcher that was conducting the study. And so one way to address that is a results-blind peer review process, where in these 10 journals in business psychology have an initiative where researchers strip the results section and of course the abstract from the, and the discussion, obviously, from the, what's submitted, and then evaluate the research without those results processes and see whether or not that affects the decision whether or not to publish the work before you see the results. The gold standard of evaluating this work is the register report format, where peer review actually takes place before the study is conducted. So at the design stage, the first level of peer review assesses the, whether or not the hypotheses and the research questions deserve to be addressed. Are these interesting questions? Do we need to know the answer to these research questions? Are the proposed methods able to address the questions? And are there enough quality control checks built into the research study? Is it a high-powered study so that we'll be able to be confident in any positive or negative results? And then after conducting the work, the stage 2 peer review only assesses whether or not the authors followed the approved protocol. Did the manipulation checks or quality control checks succeed? Were they competent, quote unquote? And are the conclusions justifiable? So as Brooke said, there are almost 3,000 journal signatories to the top guidelines. Being a signatory is simply a statement of support for the general principles that the top guidelines cover. It's not a commitment to do anything. It's basically a commitment to consider what these issues are. And what we're actively working on now is engagement with each of those journals to decide what is the appropriate level of transparency for them. So as a publisher, becoming a signatory just basically provides a common framework for all of the published journals to decide which of the different standards are right for them. It basically allows individual journals to speak the same language and decide and pick and choose the policies that are right for them, that they are able to enforce, and that they're able and willing to enforce. And it's not a mandate or to create any sort of blanket policy across all journals within the publishing house. So how do we enable, how do we incentivize these types of behaviors without placing too many burden on editors, publishers, researchers, or anybody in the ecosystem? Well, we could create mandates, tack on extra steps, appeal to everyone's better nature to be more reproducible and transparent and good, but that's basically a recipe for failure. Well, it's not a recipe for failure, it's a recipe for a headache in order to address the compliance issues and everything. So the ultimate way to get to these policies and to see real action is to align these scientific values of openness and reproducibility with the more concrete rewards of getting published, basically. And then once you do that, make tools that make it really easy to do that, and making open science as easy as clicking a button. So at the Center for Open Science, we build the Open Science Framework that it enables you to document each step of the research cycle and create a persistent link to all those different steps. Has a lot of the features for collaborative workflow, documentation of steps, persistent archiving built into each project that's worked on one of the project pages on the OSF, Open Science Framework. We have additional incentive programs to encourage these actions. So these open science badges programs are just badges awarded to, or just visual signals added to an article to reward, to allow researchers to brag a little bit that they're doing something pro-social, a little bit better. And it seems silly, but when the journal Psych Science adopted those badges at the beginning of 2014, they saw rates of data sharing go up from about 3% to about 40%. And the lines at the bottom are 4 comparison journals in the field. So there isn't a groundswell of data sharing going on in the community. I think they all have policies that are data sharing encouragement statements. And that's all they did. Psych Science didn't mandate anything. They didn't require disclosure even of data sharing policies. They have since done that. But during this period, the only thing they did is allow researchers to brag a little bit, to show off that they're doing something a little bit better, and they saw a dramatic increase in data sharing. This is a screenshot from this morning. Their most recent issue, 11 articles, 10 of them had open data or open materials. That by a sample of 1, they're at 90% or something now. Another incentive program, a pre-registration challenge. Again, outside the clinical sciences, most researchers don't know about registration or the benefits of pre-registration. So we're bribing folks to give it a try. Just go look at the workflow, and you might be eligible for one of the $1,000 prizes. So we built a workflow for researchers to create these persistent read-only research plans. Again, the purpose of it is to create your research plan, cite it in your article, and then just make the distinction between your confirmatory and your data exploration part of the study more clear. What you can do as publishers or society, either whatever type of publisher you are, these are steps that you can take to engage with these open and reproducible research practices. And with that, I'll bid adieu.